Okay, this is a description of a SaaS model for Brian and Bryce, so that you guys can get a little bit familiar, a little bit of reference, and then Nate and I are going to need your help in putting in some, basically a chart of accounts and an org structure to drive a lot of the expense stuff. This model, as it stands, focuses mostly on the top line stuff. We build out a bunch of cubes and modeled sheets that drive top line new ARR bookings and renewal stuff. So a bunch of sheets, starting at the top. We've built out some income statement, balance sheet stuff, none of which is populated. I think this was largely inherited from kind of the standard pack model, but hopefully once your stuff goes in here for the chart of accounts and org structure, we can populate this out. Our model kind of really starts on this tab here, which is the ARR summary sheet, which is kind of the focal point, crown jewel of the stuff that we've built. This is where all of the ARR bookings is summarized and aggregated. And then all of these other sheets here, the ARR pieces as well as the sales pieces, kind of all feed up and roll up into this ARR summary. So let's start there. A couple of high-level things. So the sort of aggregation of all of the things that are happening on a SaaS model are kind of captured in this ARR under contract, which is almost like a cash flow approach to looking at your total ARR under contract, where you start with the beginning balance. There's some adds, some upsells, some deletes, net change, and then a resolution. And all of the stuff that we've built kind of shoehorns into one of these areas. So new business obviously popping up here. For us, the renewal stuff, which is driving both the add-ons, which we sort of said happen at the time of renewal, as well as the churn. And so renewals forecasting is sort of impacting these two lines, and then they kind of net off, and you kind of see the growing trend. Okay. This was all done on a standard sheet, and there are custom accounts that are driving all of this. I can show you that quickly. We're going to clean up a little bit of this, but all of the ARR accounts, you can see the customer, we set up this custom accounts, and the structure here mimics what you see on the sheet there. So same thing for the KPI sheet, which I'm going to show kind of later on, which are all done as custom accounts. We kind of steered away from using a lot of metric stuff, just to kind of give some people flexibility in terms of the formula being different go forward versus actual and things like that. Okay, so again, we start with this aggregated level of ARR reconciliation. There are a handful of key metrics. These are the sort of few metric accounts that we kind of took a view of. Now these will sort of never change, and they're pointing back up at this one. So you can see there's a year-over-year growth rate on the new business here. There is an upsell percentage that's calculated as a percent of the beginning ARR balance. And beginning ARR is a little bit tricky, it has some weird weighting so that it rolls up correctly over time. That's driven by an assumption account that's somewhat unique. Another churn is a percent of beginning ARR, and then finally an ending ARR growth rate, which is looking back at this account here. Okay. All right, now let's get into some of what's behind these numbers. So beginning balance is pretty straightforward. It's just referencing the ending balance from the prior period. When we get to new, there are a couple of sort of methods that we set up for driving new ARR bookings. And the thought was this is sort of the most important thing that SaaS companies typically are doing and want to do in their model, and this is the one that kind of resonates with them because it's kind of the focus area for a high growth company. And what we did was set up 3 different sort of methods, one being a price volume approach. So this is sort of a typical price times volume equals total. It's very similar to one of the ways we model internally at Adaptive. The next is a rep capacity model, which is based on headcount off of the personnel sheet, then a bunch of sort of lookup tables that Nate built around quotas, etc., and mapping, that kind of thing. And then a third model, which is called Pipeline one, and this is basically a modeled sheet that we capture all of the opportunities out of Salesforce for the pipeline, and then that sort of drives the bookings directly as just an aggregation of these granular detail off of the modeled sheet. And what Nate's built here is basically a triggering mechanism. So you are basically selecting a model that you want to drive like real new ARR that's sort of going into the model. And you can see right now I have it set as just 100% off of the price volume model, looking backward and looking forward. And that can obviously be changed. So if you wanted to use the pipeline model for like the first quarter, because you have visibility there, you put 100 here and then zeros and zeros. If for Q2 and Q3 you wanted to do a mix of kind of maybe 50-50 between your price volume approach and your rep capacity approach, you could kind of do that. Okay. And the thought is, and Nate and I kind of went back and forth on this, like, will somebody actually use this mechanism? And the trigger is kind of secondary to, we want to just display that there are a couple of different methods that people tend to use. You can use one or more of them, but they're all, the infrastructure is here in place to accommodate them, and then you would just kind of select out what you want to use. Internally adaptive, we kind of do all three. We do pipeline analysis, we also have price volume and rep capacity, and these two interact not so much on a triggering mechanism, but we sort of calculate them and look at and think of them in terms of coverage. So price volume is the sort of plan of record, and then it informs capacity. That's kind of how we treat it. Okay, well, without further ado, this is just the mix, and then these are the real dollar amounts coming in. And so we're going to kind of dive into the backup behind these. So the price volume one is driven by price volume cube sheet here. And you can see it's pretty straightforward. So just volume, which is logos, times average deal size, which is price, gets you to a total here. And it's dimensionalized by obviously the level dimension, which the primary area we're utilizing here is buried down in the sales side of things. So you would dimensionalize this based on your sales org. And so right now we have it set up as regions. This could be, you can whittle this back as necessary, but I think we just, for the reference, we leave in these large things, and then it doesn't need to be as granular. They would just sort of change roll-ups and tailor that. So that's what's going on in the sales plan stuff. We additionally put one other dimension on here just for kind of demonstrative purposes. We selected product, but again, as you guys know, it can kind of be anything. The other thing that we put on here, just for sort of exemplary purposes, which it's not being utilized, is the ability to do add-ons and model them kind of the same way on a sort of price volume basis. In the model currently, the add-on stuff that we do, because we do have add-ons in here, is driven like sort of attached to the renewals, and so we're sort of looking at it a little bit differently. But this is a valid way to be forecasting add-ons. This is actually how we do it internally. We don't do it attached to the renewal stuff. We carve it out separately because we sort of track it and look at it that way. So the infrastructure would be in here if the customer wanted to accommodate it that way. Okay. So you put in your price volume stuff here, and that feed this first method of doing it. Second method, the rep capacity based, is I don't know if it's more complicated. It certainly requires a lot more backup stuff. It kind of starts on the personnel sheet. Obviously, it's rep capacity, so you put in a bunch of reps, you put the level that they're at. You grab all of the normal sort of information that you want about personnel to drive what you guys are going to help us out with on the expense side. And then Nate, for the time span element on the model, worked in the ability to specify a monthly quota that's specific to the individual rep. And then he has a trigger here which makes it sort of the default or the specific one here. So you would be able to select a custom one and populate all of the quotas quotas here. Right now they're all just set to default. The reason that is because he wants to set up an ability for you to manage that at kind of an aggregated level. So what sits behind here is obviously the default quotas. Comes up. You can see you can specify them by level, and you just drop in the quotas for each of the time periods. And then there actually is a little bit of dimensionality here, which I've laid out flat. You can do it for, basically he has 3 types of personnel, people, so when you're selecting a person, you're also selecting a job title here, which will drive which one of the quotas they get hit with. The accounts that are on here, let's see, are not only the amount of the quota, but also the attainment percentage that they get.
The only thing else you're missing is that the next renewal, and you can piece that together based on Salesforce.
Sort of configure
yesterday,
so right
spent
now,
about 3-4 hours doing this.
the SME guys are doing
As of right now,
100% attainment, and the enterprise accounts are set at sort of 90, but that would be flexible. The other portion that's driving the rep-based model is a ramping schedule. And so right now he has ramping schedules for the 2 different account types. And then the last piece is the product mix. And this was one we kind of debated on whether or not we needed it, but we kind of left it in for the time being, which is basically an allocation of their quota across the different products. And what that will do is be able to shoehorn it into the same dimensions that we've built up in the price volume approach. And so all of the rep stuff is summarized in this rep model summary, which you can see here gets the number of reps, ramp reps, quotas across the org structure, as well as across the dimension of SME versus enterprise type. And that all flows back into this rep capacity-based line here. Okay, the last new ARR method is the pipeline one, and this is driven by a pipeline database here. And the pipeline database would be a dump that you're getting out of your Salesforce instance. We have just a bunch of dummy data in here now. You can see you're capturing account name, opportunity name, some sort of stage, which could drive probabilities here, which you see, as well as an ARR amount. We have a little bit of information here which we're not sort of utilizing, but could be in here if somebody has a different sort of approach to how they're getting their data, which is sort of term and also services stuff, as well as sort of additional dimensions which we're not sort of utilizing now. Right now, this stuff is all on an ARR basis. We're not doing and haven't brought in any of the complexity of multi-year contracts and the impacts that has on cash, and that would sort of be kind of a more complicated version of the model, and leave that for some customization that would need to happen on top of it. But it's all minimally doable. It just makes the thing a little bit more complicated out of the gates, and we kind of just said, let's keep it on in terms of ARR. So what sits behind here, model. Are a bunch of modeled accounts that are looking at the pipeline database and rolling up things like unweighted ARR and weighted ARR. Weighted ARR being the product of probability times the ARR value. Unweighted just being the gross sum of the ARR. And these are all looking at the close date and then dropping those into appropriate time periods here. You can see I just kind of put all of the times close dates into 17, the thought being that pipeline is typically a near-term exercise, and the information gets worse kind of as you go out further. And so if you were using this to drive your model, it would probably be in like the a quarter out or possibly 2 quarters out. And once you got further out, you would have to rely on these other mechanisms that are modeling based, price, volume, or capacity. Okay, that's the new ARR sort of approach. And again, the thought was show people the depth of approaches that you can take here, and one of those methods should resonate with how they're modeling things. We have the infrastructure to accommodate one or more of them as the sort of customer wants. Okay. The other piece, besides new, so we can hide some of this, actually hide all of this, that the SaaS companies will care about is the renewals modeling. And that's handled kind of down here, and then drives the bottom 2 pieces in our model, which are the upsell and the churn that's happening. So the way we modeled this was actually similar to the pipeline mechanism. So we start with a known book of business, which we've reflected on the customer database here. Again, that is a modeled sheet here. We'll go into this back into that. See, there are a whole lot more formulas in here. Nate's actually in the process of cleaning this stuff out. It's mostly the ARR ones and the renewal at risk ones that I'm using to drive this, but he's going to clean this up for you guys. Okay, so go back into the customer database, and again, it's similar to the pipeline one. It's a bunch of accounts, some dimensional information. We tag them with some cohorts, so you could use this for cohort reporting. We haven't set that up in this model, but you could. Some product dimensionality, and then start dates, end dates, which we're using to determine when the booking and renewal will show up on the model, as well as contract value, and then a ARR calculation, which Nate set up to use duration to sort of imply the ARR value. We might want to at least think about having a standard approach to this between this customer database and the pipeline one. The pipeline one is kind of just input the ARR, and if that's the case, perhaps this could be simplified, and so we don't have to do this calculation for them. Alternatively, though, it is kind of good to acknowledge a lot of customers will have multi-year things going on. We can sort of accommodate that. The only thing that's tricky about the way this is set up is the retention assumption. So much like the quota sheet that's happening on the personnel sheet, there is a retention default assumption and an upsell default assumption, and then there's also the ability, you can see the default element here, to set a custom one here. So what you would do is select custom of the 2 options here, and then you just type in a value that's the custom amount, and that'll determine both the churn and the upsell properties that we're going to model. And so if a customer wanted to do stuff on a granular basis, they have specific expectations around individual accounts, and they can accommodate that, as well as if they just have kind of a general approach to modeling churn and want to apply a global assumption, maybe across dimension or that kind of thing. So we would kind of be able to be flexible. And what this all drives is an expectation on the known ARR that is coming up for renewal. So if you sort of drill down on a particular area here, let's pick a big one, June 17 here. Sales, trace down the rabbit hole. This will take us to these 2 renewals, Maggie Tech and Charlotte, which should be reflected here. Okay, Maggie Tech and Charlotte, both of which come up. Contract ends in May, and so they're popping up a month out in June for the renewal. I think he added a month to it. Or no, sorry. Well, anyway, you get the idea. That's kind of half the picture, which is the known schedule of renewals here, and that's kind of the near-term picture, which is what drives behavior in the sort of immediate future and expectation. but we wanted to make this model sort of complete so it could look out further. And so what happens is, as you can see kind of lying down here, there's also the full picture of your renewals will not only be the known stuff that's for existing contracts, but also new bookings that you're going to do this year, which then will have renewals in the following year. And so we built in a modeled ARR account here, which is formula driven and is looking back not only at the known renewals, but also the new business that you're doing in the year prior. So this line here is driving it, and this line here is driving it as well. And for each of those, we're applying a default. That's just what's coming up for renewal and is at risk, so to speak. Then there is the calculation of what do you actually renew, and that's driven by kind of a mix of these default churn and upsell percentages, which you can see here, as well as the specific expectations that you've put on a renewal based on a granular customer by customer approach. And I guess one thing to mention here, let's just go into the formula a little bit. Oh, I guess we need to be at the monthly level. We can just explore. Okay, so this is, you can kind of see what's going on here. So this is the renewal ARR that's coming off of the existing customer database, so that's looking at a granular level, resolving, is this a default assumption one, or is this a specific one, putting the ARR in there. Then it's taking a look at the modeled ARR account, which is a little bit hidden here, but is this row here, which is the sum of the modeled stuff, and then applying a at-risk churn assumption, which is this 10% down here. And then there's a secondary calculation, which is, well, what would renewal ARR look like, including the upsell? And the approach Nate sort of took here was, okay, I can show the formula, it's a little easier. So again, similarly, it's the renewal plus the at-risk ARR, that's the modeled piece, then you're applying the churn assumption, so you sort of get down to 90%, and then you sort of the 90% that's left, what they do 5% add-ons, so it's multiplying by 1 plus 0.05% again. And that's kind of like, it's an order of operations approach. It's not kind of, this doesn't net out to just negative 5%. It's something slightly less because you're only taking a 5% bump on the 90% that's left here. Again, that's one sort of way that people model upsell. The other one primarily is sort of through the price volume approach, where somebody has put in a formula for volume of new or volume of add-ons being sort of related to the size of the existing customer base. We haven't populated it out, but the infrastructure is in there to handle it if they want to write those formulas. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. Then there are a couple of calculations at the bottom here, which are taking this is the sort of blended result of these default churn assumptions here. So a mix of, not only the default, but also the specific ones that you've customized on the customer database. And this is giving you kind of an end result here. So you can see the results when you use the default ones are sort of very similar. So 10% churn means 90% retention rate, and then the 5% bump is sort of here. That's kind of out in the future. But for these renewals that I modeled specifically, I was pretty, wanted to show up. So I modeled some pretty specific churn events, and the rates came out sort of much lower, so you can kind of see what's going on there. Okay, that's the extent of the ARR kind of summary sheet, as well as we covered price volume, the 2 customer and pipeline databases, as well as all of the HR and sales modeling, ramping that drives that stuff. Nate also built basically an expense forecasting mechanism into 2 modeled sheets here, an event one and a G&A one. There's also, I won't show those as they kind of work the same the way normal expense modeling kind of works in a model sheet.
Even though we don't see it, that's what's happening.
I will show you there is a little lead gen sheet that he built up. I think it's just a standard one. Yeah, and what he's looking at is leads, conversion rate, opportunities, inbound and outbound approach to that, and that driving cost per head. This would be sort of a little sheet you would use for if you wanted to bring lead gen into the model. It's not linked up to anything now, but you could very easily link it to drive cost on the marketing side of things, as well as have the leads kind of connected to your volume assumptions on what you need to hit your sales plan. The other piece that's in here that's a little bit unusual is this benchmarks sheet. And let's see, we need to go.
I think we get that wrapped around.
This is for the OpEx engine benchmarking stuff, which is Lauren Kelly's third-party data for benchmark stuff that SaaS benchmarks that you can bring into the model. The way we did it was, again, with a bunch of custom accounts called benchmarks, and I dump these out of Lauren's tool. There's a website where you can kind of select a cohort, and then you dump a bunch of these metrics. I bucketed them into a few kind of areas. I took kind of just a much abbreviated list. She literally gives you like hundreds. I picked, I think, 50 or 60 or so of the ones that I thought were important and dumped them just into this sheet here. I have the templates that will maybe need to create the accounts and upload the data. But you can see it's just kind of a flat number for a whole bunch of different metrics. These metrics are, with the exception of like 1 or 2, they're all kind of quotients or ratios that aren't sort of dependent on the individual size of a particular account. And they're all, she collects her data on an annual basis, and so the way I wanted it to sort of appear in the model so that then you can spin up a dashboard that's helpful is to kind of just flatline things across the time. So while she's collecting this on an aggregated level at an annual basis, when you will sort of make a chart, what you're going to have is your own individual metric here, so SaaS percent of revenue that's going to be somewhere in your model. It will vary monthly depending on how you're sort of doing things, or how your actuals transpire. But when you compare it to a benchmark, I want the benchmark to show as kind of a flat line across the time period. And I'll kind of show you that in a minute or two. But so the point is basically everything on here is sort of flat across time, whether it's a metric or an aggregated amount, or ACV per customer kind of thing. And so you can kind of see these. So your data will be like flexible, but the metric data or benchmark data that you're pulling in is just going to be kind of a line that you're sort of shooting for or trying to beat. That just seemed like the quickest, easiest way to get data into your model and have it sort of work the way you would want it to work. This again presumes you pick a cohort out of Lauren's tool and dump it in here. If you want to use another cohort, you would just sort of pick a different one in her tool and then just upload different data. And you leave it at this sort of data level, but not do any sort of new account creation or new versioning to accommodate that. And then the output for this looks like kind of a discovery sheet where you would forget which one I did here, but yeah, so dollar retention. The benchmark would just be a flat line that came across, and then your individual data that came out of whatever account in your model was attached to it. Would be kind of variable, and you would say, okay, well, here's what we're shooting for. Okay. Let's see. Oh, one other thing I want to show is KPIs. So the approach we took to KPIs was to do a KPIs sheet as a user-restricted sheet, so that somebody could build a big model and then kind of paste everything into this KPI sheet via links or just hard uploading or however they wanted to, and then that would be shareable regardless of the org structure and hierarchy. And so you would just configure access to this at an aggregated level, and that would short circuit a lot of the challenges that you sometimes run into with permissioning access based on level structure, but wanting some metrics to be broadly shared around the org. So anyway, there's this KPI sheet. For everything on the KPI sheet, I kind of shoehorned it into a single top level only. So all the data, regardless of where it's coming, the model is coming into this single level here, and then all of the KPIs reporting that we're going to put on top of this for the discovery dashboards or the Office Connect will kind of come through this bottleneck. And I've gone down, and you can see kind of the varying areas that I've dropped into here. Some of these are driven by the model. A lot of them I've just kind of wired up formula directly on here. A good portion of this, all the financial stuff, I'll need to change up once you guys put an org structure or and a chart of accounts in here. But for right now, they're just being driven by some assumptions I've kind of made about how this should look. So let's see here. I'll give you an example. So marketing expense is just 10% of top line revenue, and that's kind of built in here. We would ultimately change these once you get the sort of underlying cost structure and model put in place, and all these metrics are set to work on top of it. Same thing on the headcount side. So this is just fudged here. None of this is driving off of the personnel sheet, with the exception of the sales piece. And that's KPIs. Well, then what sits on top of the KPIs sheet here, actually, sorry, one thing to underscore, again, so some of this is model driven, others of this, like, I think it is helpful to be able to talk to people and say, look, here's this KPI sheet, this is infrastructure you can use to run your board pack. Even if all of your data is not necessarily in the model, you have the ability to, via the Excel for planning interface, just kind of attach this to a spreadsheet that maybe marketing has that's keeping track of their leads, or have the source be sort of individual contributors instead of sending them sending you PowerPoints that you have to aggregate. This would be the mechanism by which you aggregate your KPI data for your company. And then what sits on top of that, and the reason you would do that, is you then have automated dashboards that kind of populate out of them. And I've built up a bunch of scorecards and things focused on particular parts of the model that we think are interesting to people, that they'll care about. So ARR, sales, rep productivity. I need to populate out a little more of the data by level and by product so that it's sort of interesting to look at here. But again, these just track through the different buckets that are on the KPI sheet that sort of people would want to care about, and then the charts and visualizations are sort of mapped to those, and you could run your quarterly business review out of Discovery, and let your business owners kind of flash through their parts of the business. Okay, that's it. This is kind of a not so brief tutorial introduction, but we want to talk to you guys about, get your feedback on what needs to change and what else we need to put in here. And again, it's the most obvious and glaring part is to put a chart of accounts and org structure that can then drive a bunch of cost stuff. Okay. Forward to talking to you guys. Thanks.